Welcome, everyone. I am Monica Obniski, the High's Curator of Decorative Arts and Design, and I'm thrilled that so many of you are joining us for this Zoom conversation. Before we get into the program, I'd like to thank the High Museum members who are in attendance this evening. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. If you are not yet a member of the museum or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this program. Now, a little bit about Zoom etiquette. I know we're all experts, but please place your questions in the chat, chat amongst yourselves during the talk. I'll be looking at that and during the talk. And just to let you all know about the program, we will talk for about 45 minutes. We know Zoom fatigue is real. We'll leave some time at the end, but we will finish up by the hour's end, I promise. I'm super excited to introduce our guests for this evening's talk, but before I do, I'd like to let everyone know how this program came about and its relationship to the High's collection. As some of you may know, I joined the High last year. It's almost my 1-year anniversary, and moved to Atlanta in the summer. And as soon as the Georgia Museum of Art reopened, I made a beeline for Athens to check it out. I concluded my visit in the museum shop where I found Susan Falls and Jessica Smith's book. And just as proof, here it is. Overshot Coverlets, The Political Aesthetics of Woven Textiles from the Antebellum South and Beyond. I gravitated toward this book because I have a genuine love of historic overshot coverlets, and because in my former position in Milwaukee, I had begun working with Christy Matson, one of the brilliant contemporary weavers that Susan and Jessica bring into the book. I was hooked, I devoured the book, and then began looking at our own collection. And now I'm gonna share my screen and show you guys what I'm talking about. So in this process, I discovered that we have only 3 overshot coverlets in the collection. These were acquired in the early 1960s and in the 70s. Well, I should say that I think we only have 3. There may be others that are unattributed, and we need to do a little bit more work. But for those in the audience that may not be weavers, this term overshot refers to the action of the supplementary weft that overshoots the foundation weave and creates this really interesting pattern. So, this is fun. There we go. So this brown one and then this red one were both accessioned into the collection in 1961, and they were given by the Fashion Group of Atlanta. Coverlets were made all over the United States. They were made in the Midwest, in New England, and of course here in the South. And while we don't know where these were made, we know at least they ended up here in Atlanta. Similarly, we don't know very much about this coverlet, which was given by a Mrs. Margaret Trotter of Decatur, Georgia in 1974. According to our documents, it was originally owned by Margaret Trotter's great-grandmother, who had been living in Virginia in the first decades of the 19th century. Now, the records do not claim that Mrs. Trotter's great-grandmother made it, just that she owned it. And I should also apologize for these terrible photographs. I took them in storage. I'm not a photographer, but it gives you a great sense for these coverlets, I think. The pattern on the High's coverlet happens to be similar to a Monroe County, West Virginia coverlet made by a Mary Ann Jones Hall Willis, whose family wove on their farm. It was created in a pattern that has been labeled, quote, 9 chariot, wheels, and table. But this kind of connoisseurship is not the point of this evening. In fact, the 3 coverlets in the High's collection barely hint at the tremendous variety of arresting optical effects that weavers created, but they do reveal that we know less about these material goods when compared to other decorative arts for many reasons. And some of those will be discussed by our esteemed guests. And now I am very pleased to introduce our 2 speakers this evening, Professors Susan Falls and Jessica Smith. Susan Falls is the liberal arts professor at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Falls received her PhD in anthropology from the City University of New York and her MA in anthropology from Hunter College. She received her BA in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Jessica Smith is a fibers professor at SCAD, the Savannah College of Art and Design. She received her MFA in design from the University of Kansas and her BFA in painting from the University of Washington. And they collaborated on this book, Overshot, which was published just last year in 2020 by the University of Georgia Press. And for those of you that haven't picked up the book yet, you can pick it up at the Highs Bookshop. This is decidedly not a material history of coverlets, right? We're not getting into weave structures or various pattern names, but instead the book uses the premise that objects are uniquely positioned to tell us about a historical moment. And arguably, more importantly, they also can shed light on our present time as well. Good evening, ladies.
Hello.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Monica.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We're really excited to be here and talk about this book and with you tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I was just really glad that you guys accepted the invitation.
Well, we were so excited because the book came out, and we actually had a book signing in Savannah, and then we were about to embark on a book tour to, we were going to a couple house museums, and we were hoping to talk more about the text and the material culture. And then, of course, you know, we all ended up on Zoom. So it was, yeah. So this phrase of the year, the pandemic happened. So it was the great thing about you calling is that we were actually just starting to talk like, okay, it's been a year now. Let's start thinking about what we can do to start talking about this again. And then you emailed, so we were so excited.
Yay. Well,
and the Christine Matson connection, like the connection between the decorative arts and also the contemporary arts. So I think that that's really exciting as well, which is something that we'll talk about tonight.
Great. So I think we should just like get right into it because we have a short amount of time and so much to get through. But in the preface of the book, you argue that beyond being aesthetically beautiful, right? And I agree, like probably many of the people in this Zoom, that Overshot coverlets can mark social, political, and economic ideas. And I suppose that this equally drew me to your study, right? Because I think that American material culture can provide multiple lenses with which to view, understand, and interpret history. But it was this specious installation, and curators out there beware, I think that started you on your journey. So I'm wondering if you could tell us like about the beginning of your project.
We would love to talk about how we started getting into this. One day I was got out of class and Jessica said to me, Susan, there is this amazing exhibit up at the Owen Thomas House, and I think we should go up there and take a look. So, you know, we walked up, it's here in Savannah, and we went, and these are some images from inside of that exhibition.
And so the reason why we were there, actually, I'll take this over because so part of my undergraduate and graduate history classes, I often bring students to give tours and look at the materials in the collection, just like, you know, we would if we were in Atlanta, coming to the High Museum and to look at what you had. And it's one of the sort of great things about being in a university and being able to access collections. And I was there on a tour and I walked up, and these are the Owen Thomas House urban slave quarters, and it's the upstairs. It no longer looks like this. They've actually deaccessioned these textiles. They've given them back and changed the entire format. There's been lots of things. I think this started about 7 years ago, actually, is when we saw this. But what was interesting is this red and white coverlet, this flame pattern was hanging on the wall. And the text actually said that it was jacquard woven. And again, we're not going to get into the sort of logistics of the coverlets and the structure of them, but this is woven on most likely a 4-harness, possibly a 6-harness, but most likely a 4-harness loom using wool and cotton. And the attribution in the sign, and I think it had been there for many, many years, was that it was jacquard woven with linen, which is the sort of a conflation of two coverlets that we know very much in the Northeast, which is the jacquard coverlets of the mid-19th century, and then the colonial coverlets using linen from the 17th century. And they were positioned as being not only possibly woven by the enslaved, but being used by the enslaved. And I was just fascinated because, first of all, I had always been under the impression that the Southern coverlets didn't exist. Right? We were always sort of, the story was always that because they had wool and it was hot in the South, right? And so these are the sort of things that started to, and then the idea that how did they end up in the slave quarters? So this sort of started our journey. Susan and I had worked together on other projects, thinking about provenance and attributions and what sort of goes on throughout history and time, the stories that are untold. And so this began this journey.
Yeah, I mean, this is super fascinating for me because, you know, you write about, you know, this kind of placement of these coverlets in the slave quarters as this kind of provocation, right?
Mhm.
And, you know, it's part of your, I think it's part of your intellectual project to debunk some of this previous scholarship, right? That used a lot of things, visual affinities as opposed to weave structures, or frankly, like historical documentation, right?
Mhm.
As opposed to using those and other methods, instead, assumptions were made about textile production in the 19th century. And again, like in a way, this is a kind of cautionary tale for all of us, right? That history really needs to be grounded in a kind of verifiable fact, not hearsay or wishful thinking. You can apply that however you want to. But as a design historian, you know, I applaud you for taking kind of aim at these unfounded arguments kind of surrounding, you know, what may be loosely called influence or visual affinities, et cetera. And you know, I think also part of your story, or you know, the broader narrative is that you argue that the story is much more complex than, you know,
Mhm.
than meets the eye. And I wonder whether you can, you know, just kind of like walk us through your kind of unpacking of these textiles that were said to have been made by slaves.
Well, you know, when we first started looking at these objects, we did not, we wondered, like, did slaves routinely have and use these kinds of objects? Or, what were the ways in which exhibition histories unfolded over time? And why did this happen? And how did it happen? We were really interested in it wasn't really our intention to debunk anything in the beginning. We were really just sort of curious about tracking these objects through time to try to figure out how they moved, from one decade to the next through different kinds of cultural and political regimes that had at times very, very different characters and very different players who had different motives and different goals in mind. And that to us made the work very, very exciting. And some of the things that we found was that different kinds of groups of people who were interacting with these objects used different, for a lack of a better word, had different epistemologies about what counted as knowledge, or how they were looking at these objects and how they were positioning them in either cultural or political contexts. And that's what when we started asking those kinds of questions, that's when some of these contradictions started to become apparent to us.
So one of the sort of big questions, and actually I want to say that I put this slide together, and it's the coverlet on the right that's behind our cover of our book, is actually the 1850s. It's not the 1950s. It's a really important detail. So please, everybody, just change that 9 into an 8. The reason why it's important detail is that actually this is a coverlet. So one of the things that we that struck us in that first coverlet is that the op art, right, quality to it, these dazzlers, these eye dazzlers. And as we started to look further into them, we started asking, so why is it that these coverlets have really held on to a colonial sort of homesteading aesthetic when we see it in the context of this this 20th century work, it really does fit into a context of op art, modernism, and all of these. And so the coverlet that's the 1850s one is actually a really interesting and it's its own book, really, but it's we call it the Lovelace Coverlet, and it's called the Lovelace Coverlet because it was donated as being from the Lovelace farm in Lorraine, Georgia, and it actually was donated in its fragments was donated to 2 separate museums. So the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum has a fragment of it. That's where these images are from, and then the slave mark collection, which then becomes the Acacia collection, also has a fragment of it. And actually they have, and both the documentation, the letters that they have, speak of a very similar story about these objects having been made on the plantation using indigo dye that was grown on the plantation by the enslaved. And so these are the sort of narratives that, and the fact that they were donated twice and all of these things really sort of set us on this tale, especially when we start thinking about the idea of how much, and there has been many, sort of not many, but there's been a few people looking at this, how much influence that they possibly had on some modernist movements like op art. So we're going to go through some slides a little bit in terms of our sort of methodologies.
So, you know, we thought, okay, how can we start to investigate this? How can we, what is the proper way to look at these objects? And we took a kind of, you know, three-pronged approach. We looked at, you know, books that we could find, any kind of documentary, you know, evidence, or books that we could find about, you know, woven coverlets or about these kinds of materials in the South. We talked to curators, we talked to docents, we talked to, you know, people who were doing estate sales, we talked to collectors, makers, and then we went on what turned out to be a very, very interesting journey in Georgia, up and down the coast, and along the, you know, what sometimes is called the Confederate Trail here in Georgia, and you know, just up through the, you know, up through Georgia, and looking at house museums and, you know, and anywhere that we could find that, you know, reported having these materials. We just talked to as many people as we could to see, you know, how these things were being exhibited, how are people talking about them, how are they being, you know, explained, what kind of documentation might they have about, you know, their collection. And that's the way that we started to try to figure out, you know, the history of this material culture in Georgia.
So just as a note about these images, on the left is the Callaway Plantation. Many of you have maybe seen it. It is actually reported by the docents to have been possibly the influence for Margaret Mitchell for the Gone with the Wind, and in terms of Tara. And then on the right is actually the inside of a house on the same property, which is a Piedmont plain style house that is listed as the house that was lived in before the house on the left was built. What we've quickly discovered is the house on the left was built actually, it was completed right after the Civil War. And so up until the Civil War, they lived in this Piedmont plain style house. And so interestingly, it is on the left is what we think of in large part because of movies like Gone with the Wind as plantation style. This is how the landscape of the South was figured. But in fact, in time-wise, on the right is actually what was going on during the time that these covers the antebellum era. So here are some books that we were looking at. This is very few of them. And actually there's the coverlet that you were talking about in the beginning. And it's repeated many times. So this led us to then look at the places in which we saw the coverlets staged in either the enslaved or post-Civil War free servants of the plantation homes. And so it's interesting because, again, somehow these coverlets take a journey from possibly the houses of the yeomen and then into these spaces. And these spaces have interesting aspects. We were starting to think about them in terms of, so the one on the right is actually what we call a summer winter coverlet. And that is a coverlet that we have never seen one that has true Southern provenance. It's one that was mostly made in the North. The one on the top left is actually in the Swan House, and it's on the servants' quarters bed. And what we thought was really interesting about that one is it does appeal to the time period of the early 20th century, right? So the black and white art deco aesthetic, right? And so in that sense, it's quite interesting. We often saw the coverlets under beds and in cabinets, right? And on children's beds. So that was another aspect. And then on the left, which is actually that sort of led us into another discussion and story about who is placing these coverlets, who gets to choose where these coverlets live. That is from Stephen's house and at Crawfordville, and that is in the Eliza's house, are the servant quarters. So who is it that's staging these coverlets? And in some cases, what we have found is that often, and actually it was told to us a couple times, that often the coverlets that are actually being staged in these are coverlets that were actually purchased as staging items, because of the idea that they were on display in a place that somebody could touch them, right? Or so they really are being staged. Right. And who is giving that story?
Yeah, I mean, this is. Oh, sorry, you've just moved the screen, but
yeah, we'll go back.
Yeah, no. All I was going to say was that this is just further reminding me of how many more places in Georgia I have to go and and see coverlets in action. But no, please continue. I mean, I think hopefully we're getting in. I mean, because this is really where the story gets good now, right? Because you're like, again, starting to kind of poke holes in the narrative surrounding these things, talking to people, talking to docents, as you say, and discovering how these coverlets are being used as kind of props, essentially. But I guess I just wanted to say that I found that the kind of theory, or rather this new character that you introduce into the mix, which you have already brought up, the kind of Yeoman, and the theory that you lay out in this chapter on plain style people, I think is really fascinating. That the descendants, the people that deposited these coverlets in museum collections, really presumed that these things were made generations ago in their family, and maybe that they were made by enslaved people. But I wonder if you can just maybe talk a little bit more about this character, the Yeoman.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, we're going to flip forward to a couple slides so that we can sort of talk about that. But I think one of the things that's interesting about this, and this is actually these are letters, and this is actually who was donating them. And so it's interesting. So the ones that are in the High Collection are donated in the 60s, right? As you can see, many of these are donated also starting around the 40s, and then up until the 60s is where we see is this time.
Documentation is so good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And the interesting part about this is that the stories that mostly women are laying out are stories that do talk about these as these homemade items. And what we took away from this as we were starting to look at it and to think about it was that these items felt like they needed to be preserved. They were important. This was a time period that many museums and house museums, and there was an interest in the material culture of the enslaved and African-American material culture. And so the people that were donating these, I felt truly that they were preserving an item that was really important to preserve in history. And I think that what they were preserving was very much true. The interesting aspect is that really led us to start thinking about what is it about these items, again, that takes it out of this, that puts this into this colonial make-do homesteading ideas. And so that actually sort of led us to sort of start to look at the yeomans, as you were talking about. And this yeoman culture that we can see, and this is the coverlet in your collection, right? And so we started to look at the material culture of the yeoman women, particularly that are weaving these. And I think one thing that should be noted is that nobody will ever know, and it is actually, there are records, and we found a few records, not very many, of the enslaved weavers weaving these coverlets for the yeoman households. But I also think it's important to recognize that because the yeoman households did have access to enslaved labor, or whether it was they would, hire labor, I'm trying to use the right word, that they would hire the labor during farming times, but that time also gave them, the women, the time to weave, right? So the fact that they weren't necessarily always having to work in the fields, and there's some interesting documentation about women in the South, and that they're very rarely presented in the fields, except for during the Civil War. So this idea of who these women were a sort of important piece to the puzzle.
And, we were looking at these coverlets, historically, but, we're also looking at the historiography of Georgia. And it's very, very interesting. I mean, probably some of the people that are here tonight might, be really familiar with this history, but, I think a lot of people are not aware that within the discipline of history itself, there wasn't really a tremendous amount of attention paid to these, what I guess now what might be, known as sort of working class, or people who owned land or rented land, and usually had no slaves, or very, very few slaves if they ever had them at all. Because most of the historical attention was around here was being paid to the planter class, or the class of enslaved labor, and not very many people worked on the yeoman, even though the yeoman made up the majority of the population, which I think is very, very interesting. And there was some, critiques by Owsley and some other people in the 1950s that, began to look at why this had happened, and, sort of, adding that element to the narrative of history. And of course, inside of that relatively, I would say, renewed interest in the yeoman, of course, not surprisingly, not that many people have written about yeoman women, and even less have written about the domestic, expressive culture of yeoman women. So we thought that, this was very, very interesting, and definitely something that we wanted to try to, engage this as an opportunity that, not that many people had written about.
Yeah, and it feels like, I mean, this is really just a beginning almost, at least in terms of this small aspect of your project.
Absolutely. And, we did not begin this project with this kind of like big context in mind.
Yeah.
But, as we walked through our beginning, some narrow questions, we discovered that there was a sort of larger context and a bigger history that needed to be somewhat fleshed out before the detailed, questions could really be answered. And, we really, we know that we raise a lot of questions in this book that we don't answer, and that we're not ready to yet answer. And we really do hope that there will be students or historians, or, makers or artists that might, pick up some of the threads that we didn't, that we weren't able to follow within the scope of this project, and really, figure out and be able to, figure out what has been going on with these objects. We think that they are, visually interesting, but they have so much potential to tell us about not just the past, but, sort of about the way that we think about ourselves today.
So I'm going to reveal something. So anybody who's in the audience who is actually at a house museum, either a docent or a curator, you might never let us in, but that bottom left image of the blue and white coverlet is an intervention. And so we somehow, actually on multiple occasions, found ourselves alone in a room.
Well, we sort of had
I hope you had some help.
Yeah. We had a little bit of a.
No, we definitely had permission to touch. We had gloves. We did all, we were being proper. But one of the things is the image in the middle is the image that we often see in house museums around the South, especially in the 19th century up until the mid 19th century. And often coverlets will be in the households of the yeoman. And also the households of the urban and merchant classes, but the coverlets are always on the bottom of the bed, as I said, in a closet, and they are framed around the white, right? So this idea of the sort of classical Greek white bedding, and so very rarely did we see them pulled up. And there has been some work done on what maybe perhaps the true aesthetic that was going on in some households, and whether the white was actually a true sort of narrative. And so we always thought it was interesting, like why not the coverlet on the bed and the white bedspread on the end, right? Like this sort of notion of flipping these things around. And so really, and I'm going to sort of go forward in this, is that what this did is it started to make us think, okay, so why do we, as in the context of the American history and the aesthetic of American history, what has since happened that has led us to make these aesthetic decisions, right? Those of us that are looking or make these aesthetic assumptions. So what is leading us to look back at history in this particular way? So this is actually an image of two artists that we have in the book. And so talking about contemporary artists, as we said, Joshua is a weaver who is often working with the juxtaposition between the hand and the machine, and thinking about the sort of complexities of the duality around labor and gender. Alison Smith is an artist who uses lots of different materials and modes to talk about the various aspects of American culture. In this particular case is the drums of war, which is the coverlet woven on the cot, is actually based off of oil drums.
Susan and Jessica, we just had a question, and I'm going to bring it up just because we kind of skirted over the definition of Yeoman, but I, want to make sure that everyone in the audience is aware of what exactly you're talking about in this particular context. So as I understand it, and you had set this up, it's not the planter class, it's not the enslaved, it is the kind of middle farming class. Is that an appropriate definition? Anything else you want to add to that?
Landowners, right? So yep. And actually there's many more classes. It's not just 3 classes. And I think that that's something that's really important to the narrative of the South. This idea that it wasn't, I mean, for so many years it was really 2, and now there's, we're starting to see many more. But the yeomen were by and large landowners, and having often doing staple crop farming, yeah, so they had usually very little, some cotton, but mostly other agricultural endeavors.
Thank you. Okay, I'm super pumped that we are now at the Jackson sisters, because this chapter kind of functions as a case study, as all of your chapters do. But this household in Georgia from the mid 19th century through 1940 or so, so like a really solid chunk of time, is super fascinating. And I was blown away that you guys found this story and that it was covered in a newspaper, and it just has all sorts, it's just a weird and wonderful tale. And so I wonder if you could tell us about it, and again, how it functions in your broader argument.
Well, Dale Couch, who was the, Decorative Arts Curator over in Athens, he, sort of put us onto this one day. He called us up one day and said, y'all, there's a great archive over at the Georgia, Historical, and I think you might want to go take a look at this. So, we went over there because we always do what Dale tells us to do. we went over there, and there was all this, newspaper articles and photographs and textiles and just letters, and it was just really a treasure trove. And we asked, who's seen this? Have these materials ever been on exhibition? What's going on with these materials? And not that many people have really looked at it. This is a photograph of the Jackson sisters here in Susan Myrick's article. And this is the article that we started with, because of course Susan Myrick was a very well-known journalist, and she did she wrote a big she did an interview. She went and visited them and wrote this gigantic article about them, and then she went back over and over again throughout her career and continued to write about the Jackson sisters, who one of the things that they have in their collection is a coverlet. And she talks, here we have, as you can see in the newspaper article, in the spoken hub, design, there's one of the Jackson sisters with a spinning wheel.
So what's interesting is many of the images that we found in this collection, photographs and others, are them with spinning wheels and talking about coverlets. We have the one coverlet as well as a counterpane. But when we started to read the letters of them, they were really farmers, and that were trying to make it as on this this land that was left to them. And they talked mostly to their cousins in their letters about farming and crop prices but the focus of all the articles and many of these which are like postcard photographs is of their spinning, weaving, and textile.
The Jackson sisters had, they did a wonderful job of sort of presenting themselves in this kind of way to Susan Myrick, who was very, very interested in, writing about the, the sort of make-do culture of, what would have, what was considered to her to be basically like the backcountry. And we discovered in this, body of work by Susan Myrick and others who are writing in this style, this one line in this article, and we've just posted it here in the PowerPoint. It says the cover lid was a handsome square design woven with the art of a Roycrofter. And we thought, what's that? Oh, but of course Jessica knew what it was, but I didn't know what it was. So we went back and started looking at, the relationship between the Roycrofters and woven coverlets during this period of time.
And so here we find, again, another reference to colonial homestead, right, Americana, and one that I think many people are familiar with when we get to this point. And this is a time period where we see people, urban women and men actually entering into the South, looking for ways to build economies and to build, to uplift. And in particular case, the Appalachia, the women of the Appalachia through their craft practices. And again, so this comes back to this idea of how we sort of picture this aesthetic. So in some ways, we could have at this time been looking towards these coverlets in terms of their Art Deco appeal and their starting to be modernist appeal. And actually, in fact, they are a perfect backdrop in this time period, given what was going on aesthetically in art at the time. It's now art history, right? So they do have a quality of modernism, especially in the black and white photography, but then they also appeal to a real sort of sensibility of Americana. And so we can move forward in that. So this is, interestingly, so on the left is actually Woodrow Wilson's, he and his second wife went to Blue Ridge Mountains, fell in love with the coverlet, the Overshot patterning, and had the entire Lincoln parlor redone in Overshot fabric. As again, American identity. And then on the right is the staging. And this was actually a staging that was taken to, I believe this was in New York, but it's a staging of the craft objects that one would find if they were to take a trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains and the types of objects that are there.
Yeah, I mean, this is all super, super fascinating, right? Because you're bringing together these like linkages in history, right? You showed us a slide of Alan Eaton, and you've shown us Sumter Pretty's American Fancy, and this idea of spinning wheels, and all of this kind of like sentimentality, right? That is being like, that is being preyed upon. And I don't know, I go back to this idea of like this being a kind of authentic America or Americana, mm-hmm. and, and how these coverlets were framed. And it's super interesting, right? That you brought up, that coverlets were in a president's, space. And so all of this is kind of like, these are, pieces of evidence that you're marshaling, towards some, a kind of a greater point. And yeah, it's all super, super fascinating. I'm conscientious of time. I just want to make sure that we kind of get to the kind of final, really, I guess, what is your final chapter, which gets to some of the contemporary artists, and you're kind of weaving in contemporary politics and even bringing in the then current president, Donald Trump, and this kind of MAGA mentality. And I guess, just kind of wondering how you see all of these pieces of kind of aesthetic and political evidence, both the historical narrative and also these contemporary interventions. In the end, what do they tell us about the Overshot coverlet, right? What makes this piece of material culture a kind of enduring point for interrogation? Why should we care?
Well, I mean, in some ways, we were trying to sort of flip this around, to instead of looking at the coverlets as a kind of, window into another time or something like that. We almost tried to use it as a mirror, to say, well, what do these coverlets tell us about us now? And how are our, sort of contemporary ideas about race and class and, rurality and, art and the role of expressive culture, and how are our ideas about that now, being reflected both in, if we think about, the sort of world of, art with a capital A, and at the same time, and just, kind of like exhibition practices. And of course, one of the things that we're very interested in is the ways in which narratives of the South are produced and reproduced, or, sometimes there's ways in which people might, interrupt or critique those narratives. And because of the history and sort of racially and class-based and gender-based charge that these things have, they really make for a powerful, almost a cipher or a symbol around which some of these conversations can take place today. And we try to, look for the different ways that contemporary artists are addressing this as a practice or as a material culture, or even, just as labor, to comment upon both the history of these objects and other objects like them, but also to think about kind of what's happening today.
I think the other thing, and I'm just going to go back to this one image, is that one of the arguments that we make is that these were aesthetic choices by the people that were promoting this particular practice. There were lots of textile practices that were done all over the South, actually all over America and the United States. And I think that it's really important to recognize that these aesthetically also fit into a period of time. And so why is it were these particular objects? And one of the things about these objects that I guess is important to bring up, not I guess it is important, is they're actually not highly functional.
Right.
They're really decorative. Like they are aesthetic objects. So they're aesthetic objects that were made purposefully as functional objects, because that was what was really important back to the Yeoman women, that they were participating in the economies and actually countering the economy of what was becoming mass production, becoming globalization. So these were artifacts that were actually working against globalization. But and I'm going to sort of go forward here, as these two artists, these contemporary artists, point out in two different ways, is that these objects, these coverlets, were also situated smack dab in the middle of commercialization, globalization, all of the things that were going on. So Roland Ricken's Unbound series, if you read on he actually self-published a book on this, a catalog of his weavings. He started weaving these coverlets because they were this epitome of Americana, and then started thinking about the fact that the materials that he was using, the madder root, the cotton, the indigo, were all sort of very much involved in the global globalization and global economy. Stephanie Sajuko's pieces on the right is really an interesting play. This is a museum collection, and what she did is she had these papers that were printed with coverlet patterns from the collection, and they were printed in China. And then she had weavers hand weave the patterns on the bags, right, that were originally made in China. So juxtaposing the sort of idea of what is mechanical production, what is hand production, and how do we sort of think about it today, and how do we look at it today?
Super beautiful work. Before you guys get out of this PowerPoint, one of the questions that came through was asking about an artist. Who was the name of the Drums of War artist that you referenced earlier?
Yeah, Allison Smith. Sorry, it's we thought that we actually really tightened up our images, but there's still a lot of them. So Allison Smith did the Drums of War, and she has a lot of really interesting work talking about reenactment and the place of reenactment in today, contemporarily, and what it says about the South.
Okay, so tell us about this beautiful slide that you have set. This is the Lovelace, right?
Yeah, yeah. So the Lovelace Coverlet, this, it's so interesting. It all comes back to the pattern, the opera, what sort of, and this pattern, again, is this textile, this fragment textile that was divided at some point. A lot of these, were divided. We had read about, and I think that there's some myth around the idea that they would unweave them to wash them. People would weave them to wash them, and then, unsew them and put them back together. But however, this ended up, this fragment, so this is the one that's part of the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum's collection. And then the other one we actually saw in a book, a Fry book, and it was part of the Slave Mart Museum collection, the Acacia Collection. And as we said, it was, the letter has said that it was woven by the enslaved on the plantation of the LaGrange, Georgia, by using indigo that was grown on the farm. And what kept coming back to us about this coverlet, which sort of started this journey looking forward to the contemporary, was really how contemporary this coverlet is, aesthetically contemporary, right? So we're always thinking about the makers and the weavers and how they are situated. But again, just looking at this as an object that is a dynamic visual object.
Thank you guys so much for this wonderful yet brief introduction to the book. I think we've got 12 minutes. We're gonna jump into some questions because people have some. And the first is someone has some coverlets passed down great-great-grandmother from South Carolina. They're wondering who they should contact about this. They'd like to make sure it gets preserved and in the right hands. Since you guys have been on the coverlet train, do you want to make some recommendations?
Unfortunately, we can't make some recommendations because one of the things about coverlets is that they still to this day basically don't hold very much value. So my recommendation would be to use it.
Great.
Yeah, put it on your bed. They're beautiful.
Then we have someone saying how the templates for the coverlids look like computer punch cards from early computer programming. That's a very astute observation. Okay, then someone's asking about a recording. The High occasionally does post these after the fact, so keep an eye out on the High's website or send an email. I'm sure that we will preserve this in some form. Okay, then Liz has asked a question. Why do you think at this time has the lens focused back on craft history, considering Glenn Adamson's new book on craft, etc., this particular current dialogue about craft? That's a great question, Liz. Do you guys want to try to tackle that?
Go ahead and you can answer that.
So it's interesting. Actually, Glenn Addison was just talking on Instagram Live today about that book, and it just came out. I'm really excited to read it. And there's been a lot of sort of discussion, especially with DIY culture, and thinking about the lens back on craft and what is the sort of function of craft and the identity of America. And we often talk about it in terms of Americana, but I think that one of the things that these coverlets sort of let us sort of think about is not only and I would say not only the craft histories, but also the aesthetic histories. And I think that that's something that this idea of sort of how do we look at these objects and thinking about, so these are very simply made and very complicated. So the actual cover of the book on the left is a weaving that I did based off of this Lovelace. And I will say that I started a coverlet and it took me about a year, and it is it's a mess. I mean, it's like, it really, I mean, it is a really complicated, repetitive pattern. And one of the sort of ideas, and actually I made Susan help me thread the loom and be part of it, because I said, if we're going to try to identify and understand these, we need to sort of do the labor ourselves and think about what that is. And so the idea that these are not just created as an heirloom, they definitely have value, but also the idea that they are makers, right? So these women are makers, and they are artists, and they are craftswomen, and they really that each of them was created, and some more than others, of course, right? But the really dynamic ones sort of let me think about, again, this idea of the process of making and the aesthetic value that we have as makers in this creative sort of enterprise. And I think that that's a really important thing about these, and that sometimes gets overlooked.
Yeah, that is actually a great point that Ellen Adams here makes about the aesthetic of these coverlets, right? That people seem to think that they were woven by people with no formal training, that they had a sort of natural ability, but clearly they're incredibly complicated to weave, and no one should think that these are easy to make. I just want to make a comment back on the Glenn Adamson point, just to kind of to say that I think, as a design historian, the last 10 to 15 years, there has been an interest in the kind of contemporary art world for craft, and I think because of that, kind of like blown open the door for, and I mean that in terms of both textiles and ceramics in particular. Those two fields have been embraced by contemporary art, and many of those makers are considered artists. And but so I think because of that, because the kind of door is open for that, that means that there's more space for craft history, and that it's being taken a little bit more seriously. And so I think the writings by Glenn and Alyssa Author and others are really a way to kind of take back a little bit some of that like ownership of that space, so that it doesn't kind of go into the art world per se. That's just my own reading on it.
No, absolutely. Actually, I just would like to jump on that with Alyssa Author. So one of the things that she did really well was also, and this is something that I think that perhaps maybe as we address it as a person who's a maker, but also a person who has worked in small production, had my own small production, I think sometimes the idea is that if we take them out of their function, the utility, like as we said, these are decorative objects, and they're not actually highly functional. But why do we have to take them off the bed? Why do they have to go on the wall to have value, right? To think about the idea that, like, as soon as we put them on the wall, then they become a piece of art. But if they're lying on the bed, then they're a piece of decorative art, and they can be easily replaced. And I think those are the things that are really are probably conversations that I think we are starting to have in terms of is it when we take it out of its functional role, does it then become art with the capital A? And what does that mean?
Yeah. I want to ask you guys, so for those that have read the book, again, it's a slim volume. It's a succinct story. You can get through it in not a lot of time. And I've just, having worked on collaborative projects, I know that oftentimes when the more people, the more words, right? But in this case, it's like, 2 people, fewer words. But and I'm kidding, obviously. But in all seriousness, I think that, I guess the question that I want to ask you guys is whether some of the kind of complexities or nuances, may not be seen in the written word here. I guess the question is do you think some things got lost in translation in the end, or are you?
No, I really don't think so, because I mean, Jessica and I have known each other for a long time, and we've worked together on lots of different kinds of projects. And we almost killed each other several times working on this book. You know, because we're coming from two very, very different places. We have different skill sets we work on, you know, our methods are different. We have different, you know, theories that we like to work with, different literatures that we're familiar with. And we really had to hash out, you know, how we were doing this. And I think that, you know, part of the beauty of doing collaborative work is that you can find those spaces that are existing in between disciplines that a lot of times really are somewhat siloed in terms of the methods that you're using or the literature that you're familiar with, even just the vocabulary. And you know, it's my feeling that we were able to find a very fertile ground in between those disciplines, you know, that you know, it's not, this book is not straight up, you know, ethnographic anthropology, and, you know, nor is it, you know, fiber scholarship or fibrous history. It's somewhere in between. And I really think that collaborative work on this kind of material is important, because it is a place where you can ask and begin to answer some of the kinds of questions that really haven't been addressed. But at the same time, Monica, I think that it is true that, you know, in some ways this is a slim volume. You know, the book sort of opens up a can of worms, you know, that, and we, you know, as I was saying earlier, we were not really able in a position to honestly, you know, follow some of these questions.
Yeah.
But I think that we did identify some ways to look at these objects that, you know, is the result of this kind of transdisciplinary collaboration.
Yes, and I think going back to something that you said earlier, which is that it's really kind of the start of something, you know,
Mhm.
for either, you know, you guys or other people out there that might want to take up the various, you know, threads that you have kind of laid bare, because
Mm.
there are, you know, there are so many different ways that this could be taken. Um, I want to bring up another comment that was made. I do believe so. Someone has said here that you might want to read "Plantation Slave Weavers Remember an Oral History." That,
Mhm.
but that I believe you did. That is part of the book. I distinctly
Yeah.
remember that those WPA interviews were part of that narrative, right?
And you know, it's interesting, like, so in the context of this conversation, you know, we really touched on lots of different little things in the book, but I think it is important. So again, whenever we talk about the subject, especially in terms of were they made by enslaved, they were highly skilled weavers in who were enslaved, and what we found in a lot of those documents is that they were working in workshop pseudo factory like situations on plantations and weaving for plantations. And so that I think it's really important. And sometimes I guess when you were saying lost in translation, I think sometimes when people hear or read about these ideas that we're putting forward, they sort of immediately think, are we saying that the enslaved couldn't weave or couldn't weave complex weavings? And absolutely not, like absolutely not. I think the thing that's really important about this particular material culture that we're looking at is that they are a part of a conversation about framing a kind of Americana.
Yeah.
That actually is in some ways that is part of our contemporary conversation today. And you brought up the MAGA hat and DIY, and I think that that's a really important thing to think about in these, is that you know, sometimes what we found was actually the women we were reading about who were weaving these coverlets actually had very different political views than we did. And I think that that's so in that way, that sort of question that we by no means, and as I pointed out before, it is because of the availability of labor, free or reduced, that often the time to make these decorative objects was available. So I think that's a really important thing to.
Okay, guys, I know I promised we've wrapped up at 7 o'clock, but I'm going to do a crazy thing here where I'm going to combine two last questions into one final question for you. and you're going to try to answer it as quickly as possible, which is going to be, I don't think it will be that.
We can do it. We can tell.
I know you can. Okay, so the question is really a two-pronged question. How did people, it's really more about like designing and weaving. So how did people do that? And then the question is this just an American phenomenon, or is this also international? That is Overshot coverlets.
Oh, that's easy. No, it's not just American.
Yeah, Overshot is actually it is, I mean, we actually couldn't even source where the origin point is, because it is a common practice of creating decorative weaving historically on a four harness loom. So yeah.
Fantastic. I want to thank you guys so much I want to thank everyone in the audience for spending this just over an hour with us, talking with Susan and Jessica about this fascinating topic. If you want to learn more, again, pick up the book and please do read it. I want to just make one comment, one final kind of comment as I close, just based on some of the comments in the chat. Even though the kind of economic value of these coverlets may be low, I want to say that the aesthetic value is quite high. So, just kind of making a statement about how we place value on things is just very complicated. And I don't know, I always think that if you love it, it's worth something. So, and Overshot coverlets are extraordinarily beautiful things. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. I'm going to actually close with our final slide, which is a coverlet that you have. But this is an image we took on the side of a building in downtown Atlanta. And once you start looking at coverlet Overshot patterns, you are going to see the patterns everywhere. And when I saw the coverlet you had and I saw that photo, I was like, they're just, the aesthetic value and the material culture value. I mean, they should be preserved, but preserve them by enjoying them.
Yeah. And eventually, as someone just pointed out here, there is a National Museum of the American Coverlet. And museums do have coverlets in their collections, like the High. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Have a good night.
Thank you so much.